I lost my memory, and during that time, I loved Victoria with all my heart. To save her, I almost lost my life in the water. But in that fleeting moment when I was close to death, I overheard her talking to her first love on the phone. I only love you. He's just a backup. Miraculously, I was saved and brought to the ICU. It was there, lying in that sterile, suffocating room, that a memory returned to me. Before I lost my memory, my heart had belonged to Victoria's sister. Later, I got married, holding the hand of the one I truly loved. Victoria, with tear-streaked cheeks, came to me and begged, "Please, can you lose your memory one more time?" Chapter 1. I thought I would never wake up again. The river was icy cold in the autumn, biting against my skin. I stood on the bank, shouting for Victoria to come back to the shore, but she refused to listen. Determined, she trudged further into the water, as if she sought nothing less than death itself. Panicked, I tore off my jacket and shoes and plunged into the water, forgetting that I was never a strong swimmer. Driven by sheer will, I fought the current and reached her side, grabbing hold of her and dragging her toward the shore. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed her up onto the bank, but when it came time for me to climb out, I realized I had no strength left, not even an ounce. And Victoria, she didn't even glance at me. Instead, she reached for her phone lying on the grass. Her trembling lips called out the name that had haunted me for years. "Justin, do you not care about me at all? I jumped into the river, and you still wouldn't come." She didn't notice that I was sinking beneath the surface. I was too exhausted to even call for help. A sharp pain lanced through my chest, as if someone had plunged a knife into me and twisted it mercilessly. For 3 years, I gave Victoria everything I could. Everything. All that was left to give was my life. But the moment Justin returned to the country, Victoria forgot all about me. Completely. It was as if she were the one who had lost her memory, not me. As I sank deeper, I saw her fingers tap on the phone screen. I thought she might finally be calling for help. But no, she answered a call. Tears streamed down her face as she said, "Justin, I only love you. No one else compares to you. Eric was just someone to fill the gap while you were away. I've always been waiting for you to come back." Even as I descended into the depths, I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. Foolish woman, if he truly cared about you, would he have disappeared overseas for 3 years without a single word? He's just playing with you, holding you in the palm of his hand, and the one who truly loved you. You've played him to death. Chapter 2. I am the only son of the Song family, the sole heir. 3 years ago, I hit my head in an accident and lost my memory. Since then, I've been hopelessly in love with Victoria. Once, Helen called me while drunk and asked, "Are you under some kind of spell? If you are, just tell me, I'll find a master to help break it for you." I hung up on her without responding because that night, Victoria was drunk, and I had to pick her up. When I rushed to get her, I found Victoria with tear-streaked eyes. Standing next to her was a man. He gave me a cold nod before hailing a cab and leaving. Victoria chased after the cab, calling his name, "Justin." I froze for a moment. I knew who Justin was, Victoria's first love, the one she could never let go of. He had left for another country without a word, and now he was back, blaming Victoria for not waiting for him and for being with me instead. Victoria squatted down on the sidewalk, covering her face as tears streamed through her fingers. I had never seen Victoria cry like this before. Whenever we argued, she'd just smirk coldly and ignore me for an entire day until I couldn't take it anymore and made peace with her. But this time, she cried so hard it was heart-wrenching. That night, I brought Victoria home and handed her a warm towel. "Victoria, if you really love Justin, I'll step aside." Victoria sobbed for a long time before falling asleep from exhaustion. She didn't say a word. I thought, maybe she realized I was her real boyfriend now. Maybe she felt reluctant to let me go, even just a little. It wasn't until later that I learned she hadn't even heard me. She was just crying too hard to notice. Chapter 3. In the end, I didn't drown. Victoria finally remembered me and screamed for help. A few elderly fishermen heard her cries and pulled me out of the water. By the time I was rescued, I was unconscious and rushed to the ICU. In truth, I wasn't entirely unconscious. I was aware but paralyzed. Like a vegetative state. I could hear everything but couldn't move. I heard Victoria frantically shouting my name beside me. "Eric, Eric, you're going to be okay, right?" She cried harder than I'd ever seen before. "Why did you go into the water when you can't even swim? Why?" I even heard her pleading with the doctors. "Please save him. He can't die." Victoria's desperation left me utterly confused. Wasn't she just professing her love to Justin? Hadn't she already decided to leave me? Why the sudden change? Then, I heard another familiar voice, trembling with anger as it confronted Victoria. "You said you'd treasure Eric, didn't you? This is what you call treasuring him." It was Helen. Ever since I asked her to help me plan my proposal to Victoria, she had blocked me and disappeared from my life. Now, she was running alongside my stretcher, her voice cracking with emotion. "Eric, wake up. You told me half a sentence 3 years ago, I've been waiting for the other half ever since. Wake up. I was exhausted. Darkness crept in, and I felt as though I was slipping into eternal night. But before the darkness fully consumed me, I couldn't help but wonder, what half a sentence? What was she talking about? I couldn't remember anything. Losing my memory really was troublesome. Chapter 4. My love for Victoria was simple. One day, I saw her wearing a beige dress, sitting in the Wang family's garden and painting. The sunlight streamed over her, the breeze gently rustling her hair. It was a picture of pure serenity. That scene struck me deeply. My heart told me I was in love with a girl in a beige dress, painting under the sun, and I had been in love with her for a long time. I had lost my memory, but I convinced myself that the girl was Victoria. From that moment on, I started pursuing her relentlessly. I showered her with the newest designer dresses and rare, luxurious jewelry as if money were no object. When Victoria craved fried cakes, I drove to the neighboring city and queued for 2 hours to buy her the most authentic ones. Because of her weak health, I learned to make soups and congee, painstakingly adjusting recipes to nurture her body. When she had insomnia, I searched for the best traditional Chinese medicine practitioners, learning so much along the way that I became an amateur expert myself. I believed I had done everything I could. Yet, Victoria was never truly happy. I could tell, her smiles were forced, strained. Then Justin came back. On the very night of his return, Victoria's 3-year struggle with insomnia disappeared without a trace. She even dreamed that night, and whatever it was, it made her lips curl into a soft, joyful smile. Watching her sleep so peacefully, smiling like that, I suddenly craved a cigarette. I had quit smoking because Victoria disliked the smell. That night, however, I went downstairs to the convenience store, bought a pack, and smoked 2 before heading back up. After Justin's return, Helen tried to caution me. You should spend more time with your sister, go shopping, watch a movie or 2, she suggested vaguely. She didn't say it outright, but I knew she was worried about Victoria rekindling her old flame with Justin. I appreciated her concern. This girl, ever since I confessed to Victoria, had taken up drinking, smoking, and riding motorbikes. People said Helen used to be so well-behaved. No one understood what had changed. Even now, despite seeing her with cigarettes and alcohol, I couldn't help but think she was still a good girl at heart. And here she was, worrying about me, while trying not to hurt my pride. Her kindness warmed me, and I smiled at her. Don't worry, I know what I'm doing. But it was just to reassure her. I didn't have a clue what I was doing. Victoria started coming home later and later. At first, she'd come back for dinner. Then, she began bringing takeout and eating late. Eventually, she started arriving in the early hours of the morning, cold air clinging to her. She claimed she was working overtime, bringing her laptop home, saying the Wang family business was keeping her busy. But the excitement in her eyes was impossible to miss. I've worked late before, there's nothing exciting about it. Yet, I pressed my lips together and said nothing. Victoria grew colder toward me. At home, we barely exchanged 10 words a day. Even when I asked her directly, she wouldn't open up. Sometimes, I couldn't help but wonder. We'd had good times together, hadn't we? Victoria used to crawl into my arms on cold nights, asking me to warm her icy hands and feet. She'd weep at romantic movies, sniffle through her tears, and tell me she wanted us to stay like this forever. We even locked a love padlock together at the temple, her arm wrapped around mine, her expression one of sincere devotion. How could it all change overnight? How did she turn into someone I no longer recognized? I couldn't understand. Chapter 5. I'm a stubborn person. Once I set my heart on someone, it's hard for me to let go. Even when Victoria stopped coming home or answering my calls, I continued tending to what had become a home for just me. Helen, on occasion, couldn't stand it. She'd argue with Victoria, but it never helped. Victoria would call me afterward and say, Eric, don't do things that make me look down on you. Don't take advantage of my sister. At first, I tried to explain myself, but one day, Victoria lost her temper and shouted, Do you think these cheap tricks will make me forget about Justin? Dream on. It was early autumn. A gust of wind swept through, chilling me to the bone. I froze in place. After a long pause, Victoria cleared her throat and awkwardly muttered, That's not what I meant. I lowered my head and chuckled bitterly. Victoria, I don't need you to stay with me. If you don't love me, let's end this. Just say the word, and I'll agree. Victoria remained silent. I waited for a while before sighing. Then let me say it. Victoria, let's break up. I may be stubborn, but I'm not unreasonable. A forced relationship isn't worth it. Yet, that day, Victoria said nothing. I thought she'd be happy when I suggested breaking up. Instead, she hung up in silence. A few days later, she called me again. Drunk and slurring her words, she said, Let me think about it. Okay, I sighed. Think about what? I need to think. She insisted. I thought I knew what mattered most, but now I'm not so sure. I shook my head. Victoria, I'm done waiting. I had endured enough lonely nights, sitting in silence, watching the dawn break through the window. Victoria, let's break up, I said calmly, putting an end to our forced relationship. But Victoria didn't respond. She just hung up again. The next day, she sent me a text message with a picture of her bedroom. I've been staying at home these past few days. Helen chimed in to back her up. My sister's been home every night. I've been dragging her back after 10 p.m. if I have to. Helen's pouty indignation made me smile. It's not necessary, Helen, but thank you. The breakup was final for me, but Victoria didn't seem to think so. She started texting and calling me constantly, acting as if nothing had happened. She even began calling me husband, the same word she once refused to say, even when I begged her. Now rolled off her tongue with ease. I didn't reply to any of her messages or calls, but that didn't mean I wasn't hurting. If, in the 3 years we'd been together, even 6 months had been like this, I might not have had the heart to say goodbye. My mind kept returning to that image of the girl in the beige dress, painting under the sunlight. That scene replayed in my memory like a spell that reminded me, over and over, of how deeply I loved her, even as I felt like a fool. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I allowed myself to imagine, what if Victoria really could change? Wouldn't that be wonderful? But it was just a fleeting dream. When Justin left the country again in a fit of anger, everything fell apart. His departure terrified Victoria. She thought he might disappear for another 3 years. She chased after him, only to be shut out. When she returned, she didn't contact me again, until one drunken night, she sent me a location with a message. Justin, I know you're back. If you don't meet me, I'll jump into the river. I knew she had sent it to the wrong person, but I saw the selfie she attached, standing by the riverside in the sunlight, wearing a simple beige dress. Her eyes were as innocent and doe-like as ever. The image blurred with a shadowy figure in my mind. I closed my eyes. I admit it, I'm pathetic. I'm still in love with the girl in the beige dress. So I went to the location she sent, pulled Victoria out of the water, and ended up in the ICU myself. I was unconscious in the ICU for many days, roughly half a month. During that time, I had a dream. In the dream, a girl with doe-like eyes filled with tears looked at me and said, "How could you not recognize me?" In the dream, I was stunned. Suddenly, I remembered. The girl I had always loved, the one in the beige dress, wasn't Victoria. Chapter 6. It was Helen. I suddenly remembered that I had been in love with Helen for 2 years. The day I lost my memory, I had been planning to confess to her. That day, she wore a beige dress and painted under the sunlight. Her fair skin, simple features, and pure smile were like a spring flowing with clarity. But she never got to hear my confession. Instead, she watched me take her sister's hand. I remembered the look in her doe-like eyes as she saw me with Victoria, how they shifted from disappointment to despair, how she fought back tears and forced a smile to wish us well. My girl, how had she endured these past 3 years? Tears slipped from the corners of my eyes. The nurse noticed and excitedly called for the doctor. "Doctor, the patient is waking up." Yes, I had woken up. The real me had woken up. When I was transferred to the VIP ward, I saw Victoria waiting outside the ICU. Her hair was tied messily, her dress wrinkled, and her eyes were swollen and bloodshot. Her face was pale as a sheet. The moment she saw me, she staggered forward, tears streaming down her face. "Eric, you scared me to death." A nearby nurse sighed with admiration. "You two must have a strong bond. This lady hasn't slept in nearly 3 days, staying by your side in the ICU. Before, I might have been deeply moved, but now, my eyes drifted past Victoria to someone else. Behind her stood Helen. She was just as disheveled and tired, her eyes just as red. Tears shimmered as she looked at me and said, "Don't do anything dangerous like that again." Sniffling, she added, "If something happened to you, I..." Her words broke off abruptly, and she lowered her head. Victoria escorted me to the VIP ward, bustling about, arranging everything for me, but I stopped her. "Victoria, could you ask Helen to come in?" Victoria froze for a moment, then hesitantly called Helen into the room. I looked at Helen. She had changed over the past 3 years. Her shoulder-length hair had been cut into a short bob, and her flowy dresses had been replaced by leather jackets and jeans. But her eyes, they hadn't changed. Still as innocent and doe-like as ever, shimmering with tears in the sunlight. I closed my eyes, suppressing the ache in my chest, and beckoned Helen closer. When she was near enough that I could see the delicate texture of her flawless skin, I spoke with a trembling voice, barely holding back the lump in my throat. "Helen, I'm sorry." "Helen, I remember now." Helen froze, her eyes wide. The next second, she covered her mouth and began to sob. Her cries were quiet but filled with deep-seated grief, the kind of pain only someone deeply wounded could feel. I felt my own tears well up. I had promised to give her the greatest happiness. Instead, I made her watch me love someone else for 3 long years. Chapter 7. Victoria never really understood her sister's life. For all these years, Her energy had been consumed by Justin. She had no idea that Helen and I had developed feelings for each other years ago, nor that I had once intended to confess to Helen. Victoria stared blankly as I apologized to Helen and watched Helen burst into tears. She listened in silence as I explained everything in a few words. Her face grew paler, her breathing uneven. When I finished, her body swayed, her nose and eyes red as she stammered. So, these 3 years with me were just a mistake. You got the wrong person. I paused for a moment before nodding. If you want to put it that way, then yes. Victoria staggered again, looking between me and Helen. Her tears fell in heavy drops. You bastard. Eric, she choked out. Her lips trembled as she sobbed. How could you tell me that the 3 years we spent together were just a mistake, just as I finally sorted out my feelings for you? I said nothing. Honestly, I struggled to understand Victoria's reaction. She didn't love me anymore. Why did it matter so much to her now? Helen shook her head at me. Eric, it's been 3 years. You and my sister have built something together. I don't want to hurt her. But I didn't respond to Helen. Instead, I looked at Victoria and asked. When I pulled you out of the water and started sinking myself, you were still on the phone with Justin. As I sank, you were telling him you couldn't live without him. I wasn't angry or disappointed anymore, just puzzled. Victoria, were you out of your mind? You watched me drown with your own eyes, and now you're acting like you care so deeply about me. Pulling the blanket over myself, I said softly. Please stop. I'm not used to this. Victoria's face turned even paler. She opened her mouth as if to explain but couldn't say a word. After all, these were things she had actually done. Helen, however, began crying again. She stepped in front of me, blocking Victoria's view, and said through her tears, Sister, I didn't want to say anything, but you've gone too far with Eric. Helen's voice cracked as she continued. How could you stab him in the heart after he risked his life to save you? Do you even remember? When we were kids, Eric saved you once before. Victoria froze. So did I. I had no idea what Helen was talking about. Helen wiped her tears and said furiously. Back when we were being followed by traffickers, Eric was visiting us. He trailed them despite the danger and shouted for help in the middle of the market. Helen grabbed my hand, her voice trembling. Because of that, Eric got slashed by one of the traffickers. He still has a scar on his hand. And you forgot all about it and treated him like this. Helen was sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. As for me, I lay there, thinking about her words. It took a long time before the memory surfaced. The pain from that injury had been so intense that my brain must have blocked it out. If no one had mentioned it, I might never have remembered. Victoria seemed to recall it too. Her face grew even paler as she leaned against the wall and said in a voice laced with despair, Eric, I forgot. Her body slid down the wall as she cried. How could I forget? Helen bent down and gently hugged me. You can forget, but I'll always remember for you. Chapter 8. I was discharged from the hospital soon after. Helen and I had wasted 3 long years. Now, I didn't want to waste another second. I decided to take Helen to meet our families. The first stop was the Wong family. Helen's parents were overjoyed to see me. Since we came from the same business circle, they knew me well and were delighted by the prospect of Helen and me being together. But Victoria was there too. She kept her head down the entire time, not saying a single word. She sat silently as Helen's parents praised how well Helen and I suited each other and began discussing the details of our future wedding. It wasn't until I was about to leave that Victoria stood up, offering to walk me out. She followed me to the door and out past the ornate iron gates of the Wong estate. Under the dim glow of the streetlights, Victoria's pale face was illuminated, and I finally understood why she had kept her head down. Her eyes were swollen and red, as though she had been crying for days. Even now, after regaining my memory and remembering who I truly loved, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness as I looked at her. Victoria sniffled, her nose red, and looked at me with tear-filled eyes so much like Helen's. She asked in a trembling voice, Eric, we were together for 3 years, and you never once introduced me to your parents. Quiet tears fell onto her pale feet as she added, but you've been with Helen for only a few days, and now you've already brought her here. I sighed. Of course, I felt conflicted. Back then, I had begged Victoria to let me meet her parents, to make our relationship official. I wanted us to have a proper identity as a couple, but Victoria always smiled, kissed me, and changed the subject. Not once did she take my request seriously. For 3 whole years, no one except the 4 of us, me, her, Justin, and Helen, knew about our relationship. How ridiculous. 3 years of love, with only 4 witnesses. Meanwhile, her feelings for Justin were common knowledge, known to everyone, including both our families. I sighed again. Victoria, for 3 years, you never wanted anyone to know about me. Have you forgotten? It was never me who didn't want to meet your parents. Victoria froze. Tears fell like broken pearls, streaming down her face. In the past, Seeing her like this would have made me forget my anger. I would have convinced myself that she was my woman and that I needed to cherish her. No matter how upset I was, I would have wrapped her in my arms and comforted her. But now, I looked at the glowing lights of the Wang estate, where Helen was waiting for me. Warmth filled my heart. I waved at Victoria. Go back inside. It's cold out. Don't catch a cold. As I turned to leave, Victoria called out desperately. Eric. Her voice was filled with anguish and pleading as she said, I miss you, Eric. I didn't respond. I walked away. Chapter 9. Helen and I got engaged soon after. After wasting 3 years, I wasn't going to delay any longer. At our engagement party, Helen wore a long dress again. Her hair fell softly over her shoulders, and she smiled at me with crescent-shaped eyes, her gaze filled with nothing but me. The party was small, with only close family and friends in attendance. Everyone beamed at us with joy, except for Victoria. She drank glass after glass of wine until she was thoroughly drunk. After the party, Helen drove our parents home, while I stayed to escort the more intoxicated guests. When everyone else had left, Victoria was still drinking. I didn't know how much she had consumed, but it reminded me of the time Justin left the country again. Back then, she had drunk heavily as well, only to return to our room in the middle of the night, wrapping her arms around me and whispering, I'm sorry. The next day, she had chased after Justin overseas. This time, however, as she drank, she muttered my name instead of his. When I approached her, Victoria wobbled to her feet and asked, Eric, did you come for me? Her eyes lit up for a moment, reminiscent of the day I confessed to her. They sparkled like stars, but those stars had never shone for me. Victoria stumbled toward me in her high heels, falling to the ground with a heavy thud as her knees hit the floor. She froze for a moment, tears welling up in her eyes. Reaching out a hand, she looked at me like a child and said, Eric, it hurts. In the past, even a minor bump would have her running to me, whining. Eric, it hurts. Blow on it for me. But with Justin, she would endure countless wounds without uttering a word. Now, she reached for me again. Eric, it hurts. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she pleaded. Eric, take care of me. Please, take care of me. I watched her small, quiet sobs, like a child abandoned, but I simply stepped back and called a waitress over. Please help this lady up and escort her to the car I ordered. I walked out, instructed the driver to take her home safely, and made a note of the license plate number. I wasn't doing this for Victoria, it was for Helen. As the car pulled away, Victoria lowered the window, pointing to her chest. Eric, it hurts here. Tears filled her eyes as she said, It's been hurting for days. Nothing helps. Eric, what should I do? I saw the despair in her eyes. What can I do to stop the pain? Eric, I shook my head. Maybe go to a good hospital and have it checked. I'm not a doctor, but I know what it feels like to lie awake at night, staring at an empty bed, clutching your chest because it hurts so much you can't stand up straight. Even now, with Helen in my life, I can't forget those days. Days when I gave my heart, only to get nothing in return. So Victoria, if you're hurting now, you deserve it. You betrayed sincerity. Did you think there'd be no consequences? Chapter 10. After getting engaged to Helen, I returned to my previous work rhythm. I used to be a workaholic, but during the 3 years I was with Victoria, it felt like a cloud of gloom hung over me. I was constantly anxious, despondent, and completely out of touch with my former self. Now, with Helen's steady presence and shared passion for her career, I felt grounded. Being with her gave me the freedom to focus on building a future for us. But what I didn't expect was Victoria showing up at my company. She didn't just show up, she passed the interview and got hired. More than that, she was a highly recommended candidate from HR. I knew Victoria was well-educated, intelligent, and capable of excelling if she genuinely wanted to, but I didn't understand why she would bypass opportunities with her own family business just to work here. Frustrated, I called her into my office for a private conversation. Victoria arrived wearing a formal suit, a style I'd never seen on her before. Her hair was tied up, and she stood in front of me, looking thinner and paler than ever. I got in through the official interview process. You can't fire me, she said firmly. Her voice carried a trace of defiance, but her eyes betrayed an intense desperation. Eric, she pleaded, her tears beginning to fall. I've never begged anyone for anything before. I've always loved and cared for my sister, but I can't let you go. I can't. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed into her hands. How could I have pushed you away like that? How could I only now realize that the person I love is you? I rubbed my temples, feeling a pang of sadness, not for her, but for the past, for everything I had endured. Clearing my throat, I said, Victoria, there's no future for us. Standing, I handed her a tissue. There never will be. Let's not waste any more time. You're Helen's sister, and we'll inevitably cross paths. Let's maintain some dignity for both of us. Victoria wavered, her body trembling. You're saying I'm undignified? She asked, her eyes red and filled with disbelief. I shook my head. Her tears fell faster as she wiped them away with her hand. But Eric, don't you think you're at fault too? Her voice trembled with accusation. Didn't you use me to fill the void when you couldn't remember who you loved? You can't deny it, can you? I lowered my eyes, looking at the hand that held the tissue. This hand had patted her back and lulled her to sleep countless times. It had offered her water and hangover remedies whenever she drank too much. It had held her tightly during cold winter nights, sweltering summer afternoons, and every moment when thoughts of Justin left her sad and vulnerable. I took a deep breath, raised my head, and looked directly at her. Victoria, can you say, with a clear conscience, that I ever used you? Can you honestly say that my feelings for you, all the love and care I gave, meant nothing to you? You're the one who was on the phone with Justin while I was drowning. You're the one who left me behind to chase after him as soon as he called. You're the one who treated me like trash when I treated you like treasure. I took another deep breath, steadying myself. Victoria, there's a price for breaking someone's heart, a price for trampling on genuine love. Victoria stopped crying. Her face turned ashen as she opened and closed her mouth, finally managing to ask in a trembling voice, "Can't I make it up to you? Can't I make amends?" I opened the office door and motioned for her to leave. "There's no need. Victoria, it's over. You need to understand what over truly means." Victoria stumbled toward the door, pausing with each step. As she reached the threshold, she turned back, tears still streaming down her face. "Justin called me," she said with a bittersweet smile. "He said he's leaving the country again. But this time, I didn't beg him to stay. I just told him to leave if that's what he wanted." Tears mingled with her smile as she added, "You see, I can leave him behind. I know it was you who stayed by my side for those 3 years, not him." I closed my eyes, cutting her off. "Victoria, my love for you is already dead. It drowned in that river." I forced a small smile, "And you were the one who pushed it under. Don't you remember?" Victoria froze, staring at me blankly. A moment later, she covered her mouth with her hand, turned, and ran out of the office, sobbing. Chapter 11. Victoria never appeared again, until the night before my wedding to Helen, when she showed up drunk and rang my doorbell. When I opened the door, she suddenly threw herself into my arms, clutching my shirt tightly. Startled, I pushed her away. Victoria smiled at me, a sad and bittersweet smile. "Eric, if I hit you hard enough with something, do you think you'd lose your memory again?" I instinctively took a step back, wary. Her laughter grew louder. "Relax, no matter what. I'm still Helen's sister. I won't ruin her wedding." She gazed at me with regret, her eyes welling up with tears. "Eric, can you lose your memory again, please?" Closing her eyes tightly, she whispered, "Eric, it hurts. It really hurts. Please." A couple of tears fell silently to the ground. Choking on her words, Victoria said, "Once the wedding happens tomorrow, there's no going back, right? I'll never be able to lean on your shoulder again, will I?" I nodded. "That's right." Victoria opened her eyes and looked at me closely, as if trying to etch my face into her memory. She smiled faintly. "Eric, why can't I just forget about you?" She waved at me and said softly, "Goodbye, Eric." After taking a few steps, she stopped, her back still to me, and spoke with a smile in her voice. "You used to ask me to call you husband, but I never wanted to. Eric, just this once, can I call you that?" She turned back to face me, tears glistening in the moonlight as she said it. "Husband." I watched her silhouette disappear into the night, feeling a dampness in the corners of my eyes, but I knew it wasn't me crying. It was the remnants of a love long dead, buried beneath the cold waters of that river. It mourned the affection it had never been cherished for, lamenting the belated realization of its worth, long after it had ceased to exist. The day of my wedding to Helen was a grand and beautiful affair. Helen looked stunning in her white mermaid wedding gown, radiating joy and grace. As I stood on the stage, listening to the MC recount our love story and watching the slideshow of our shared memories, I felt nothing but gratitude. Grateful to fate for waking me up in time. Grateful for leading me to the person I truly loved. Helen clutched my hand tightly, her eyes red and brimming with tears, crying like a little rabbit. I wrapped her in my arms, comforting her, but my gaze drifted unconsciously to the audience below. There, at the main table, sat Victoria. She wore a beige dress, her long hair cascading over her shoulders. Her smile was radiant, yet tears silently streamed down her face. Someone asked her why she was crying so much. Victoria wiped her tears and smiled at me. "Nothing. I'm just so envious of my sister. She has the best husband in the world." Chapter 12. Time flew by like a fleeting horse. Helen and I unknowingly journeyed through 12 years together. Our careers flourished, and we were blessed with a son and a daughter. Life was peaceful and fulfilling. As for Victoria, she left the country the day after our wedding. She stayed abroad for over a decade. Each time she returned, it was brief and hurried, and I hadn't seen her in over 10 years. That was until this year. When Helen underwent a minor surgery, Victoria returned to visit, and we met in Helen's hospital room. She was still as thin and pale as ever, dressed in a beige dress. She greeted me quietly. "Long time no see." I teased her. "You really love beige dresses, don't you? How many do you own?" Victoria opened her mouth as if to respond but lowered her eyes instead, saying nothing. She only offered a faint, bitter smile. From her bag, she took out a small gift box. "I run a studio in Italy now. I carved this myself." Opening the box, I found a pair of figurines, a man resembling me and a woman resembling Helen, sitting peacefully together. Victoria cleared her throat. "I didn't have any photos of you two at hand while carving, so I had to rely on memory. I hope you like it." Helen and I nodded enthusiastically. "It's beautiful. You captured us perfectly." Victoria smiled softly. "I'm glad you like it." She walked over to Helen, gently brushing her hair. "Think of it as my blessing. I wish you both a lifetime of love and happiness." After a pause, she added quietly, "And to always treasure each other." Helen nodded with a warm smile. As I placed the gift aside, I asked, "Victoria, I heard you're still single. Haven't found anyone yet?" She glanced at me briefly before shifting her gaze to the bright sky outside the window. After a moment, she smiled faintly. "No, I haven't. Being alone suits me just fine." She let out a self-deprecating laugh. "My standards are too high. I keep hoping to find someone who would risk their life for me, but I haven't met anyone like that again." Helen offered her a few words of comfort before growing tired and falling asleep. Victoria stood to leave, and I walked her out. As we stepped outside the hospital and onto the lawn, the sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over her beige dress. A gentle breeze played with her hair, and for a moment, I saw the girl from years ago, painting under the sunlight. But now, the girl smiled with a calm grace. "That's enough. Eric, go back inside." I nodded and turned to leave, but just as I took my first step, I heard her quiet, wistful voice behind me. "I miss you so much." It was so soft it felt like she was talking to herself. Why can't the world turn back time? I paused but didn't look back. Ahead of me were my wife and children. Behind me was a solitary figure mourning a love that had long since died. Love doesn't resurrect, and feelings can't rewind. We can only keep moving forward, accepting the justice of what we sow and reap in love. Facing the sunlight, I strode forward toward the woman I loved, never looking back again.